The boy lay awake, counting raindrops on the tin roof, unaware he was listening to mathematics. There was nothing but rain and the boy's breath. The Vermont night crept cold through the warped tin sheets, carrying the smell of wet iron and cut hay, as though the whole wooden house was breathing with the lungs of the farmland. 12-year-old Caleb Miller lay still, eyes open in the dark, listening to the roof. Each drop was a key on a piano, each pause a breath between notes. And in that stillness he noticed something new. The rain was not chaos. It had rhythm. His attic room was no more than a cramped alcove, walls bent inward with age, where a frayed clothesline tapped the plank wall with a faint ting whenever the wind came through. His father's battered alarm clock ticked on a wooden crate beside the bed. Tick, tick, tick. Beneath those sounds, the rain was supposed to be random. At times, it rattled like spilled seed. At times, it galloped like cattle over a wooden bridge. Yet, after the frenzy, it often returned to a near-familiar beat. 3 quick taps, 1 slow, then a pause about the length of 4 breaths. Caleb tested it with his chest. Inhale, exhale. 1, 2, 3, 4. Tap. Again. Again. Strange, he whispered into the dark. Was the storm repeating itself? Downstairs, his father snored lightly after a long day struggling with wet fields. Near the stove, their calico cat Birch twitched in her sleep. His mother had set out pans under the worst leaks, each bowl catching drops with its own voice. Those sounds, snoring, feline breath, a ticking clock, and drips into pans, made up the orchestra of the Miller house. Yet tonight, Caleb heard only one instrument: the roof. He sat up, pulling the patched quilt to his chin. The leak above his bed had been patched the previous year with a scrap of tin from an oil drum. 4 nails, 4 new holes. Now the water traveled around the patch and fell neatly onto the floorboards. He had memorized that sound. Small drops were sharp, hollow. Heavier drops rang round and full. With his eyes closed, he could tell them apart. And tonight, he realized the heavy drops often came in pairs, as though the cloud had grown suddenly rich. Tap, 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 tap. Tap, 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 tap. The pattern teased him. Caleb reached for his pencil stub but found nothing in the dark. He tried another way. He placed his right hand on the wooden frame, drumming once for each drop, twice for double taps. Soon, his hand was moving in a rhythm he had not invented but discovered. Maybe the rain has a cycle, he murmured, careful not to wake the cat. A cycle is something that comes back. He remembered his teacher once explaining the seasons, the turning earth, the red maple leaves falling each autumn. Cycles came back. But rain, grown-ups always said, was chance. If it came back, was it chance at all? The wind puffed the cloth curtain. Moist air pressed against his bones. Caleb hugged his knees, staring at the water stain above him shaped like the outline of Vermont itself. He didn't know the words Poisson process or rate L, but he was learning by ear. Measure the gap between drops. Sometimes long, sometimes short, yet often clustering around a usual. That usual was like the way old farmers measured corn. 1 bushel more, 1 bushel less, but about the same each month. Adults would call it an average. If given chalk and a blackboard, Caleb might have written so many drops per minute. Then looked shyly at the window, embarrassed at his scrawl. But tonight his only blackboard was the roof, his only chalk his memory. He tried another clock, his own heart. Hand over chest, thump, thump. Tap! A raindrop. Between 2 drops he counted 3 heartbeats. Another time, only 2. Once, 2 taps came inside a single beat. Rain and Heartbeat spoke to one another in silence. If an old neighbor had been there, Caleb might have explained gently, "Sir, I just count how long until the next drop. Sometimes it's quick, sometimes it's long. But if you count all night, you'll see it hovers around a pace of its own." In grown-up language, that was probability, the measure of chance dressed as numbers. The storm softened. Downstairs, the pans grew quiet. Caleb's eyelids felt heavy, but a question tugged at him. If the rain had cycles, how long was one? He thought of the freight train passing through the valley each Tuesday at 7:10 sharp. That was a clear cycle, 7 days. Rain seemed more like breathing, bursts, pauses, bursts again. He decided to count an entire burst. Using his father's clock ticks, he measured 40 ticks for the first burst, 38 for the next, 42 for the third. Not equal, but near. Near enough, Caleb smiled. Farmers used that phrase when guessing a cow's age or the depth of a pond. In mathematics, it meant around the mean. It comforted him. Even chance had its humble habits. He lay back down. In his mind, the taps became marks. Single dashes, double dashes, then spaces, a string of signs, a sequence. If he could keep them, he could compare storms. Compare, another important word. He imagined saying, "Last night the fast burst lasted 40 ticks. Tonight 38. That was science in farm language, simple enough to guide tomorrow's work. Then another thought. When the wind gusted, the roof drummed faster. When the air stilled, the taps slowed. Rain was moving with the wind. That moving with was a relation. Mathematicians would call it correlation. Caleb had no such word, but he felt it. He turned to his father's coat on the wall. From the pocket peeked a carpenter's pencil stub. His heart jumped. Chalk. He needed chalk. A mark on wood would tie the storm to memory. He crept downstairs, the floor groaning under bare feet. At the tool shed corner, he found a nub of chalk used to mark feed sacks. Tiny as a seed, but enough. Back upstairs, he pressed it to the plank floor. 1 line for 1 drop. Space. 2 lines for a double. A longer gap. Again. Soon the board carried a trail of faint marks, bursts and pauses like cattle queuing at a trough. By the time the chalk wore down to a crumb, he had captured the voice of the storm. He sat staring at the pale marks in the moonlight, childish scratches, meaningless to anyone else. Yet to Caleb they were a map, a secret script. He traced them with his finger, smiling. "Hello, teacher," he whispered, not sure if he meant the storm, the roof, or something greater, mathematics itself. Years later, if someone asked where his love for numbers began, he would think back to this night, not because he solved an equation, but because he wrote his first marks. He had crossed a hidden threshold, from hearing to recording, from feeling to counting, from counting to understanding. He placed the chalk crumb on the windowsill. Moonlight caught the scratches like silver hairs across the plank. He curled beneath the quilt. Birch hopped onto his feet and purred. The house sighed with wind. Somewhere below, a last drop struck a tin pan with a clear ping. And even as his eyes drifted shut, Caleb made a small promise. Tomorrow and the nights after, he would keep writing the rain. Awkward chalk lines, secret tallies, because he had heard something too strange, too beautiful to forget. A roof had become his classroom, and water his first mathematics. Outside, the storm wandered into the pine hills. Inside, a farm boy fell asleep with a smile, his first lesson carved in white chalk on old wood, the song of a leaking roof. By the next evening, the rain had returned, softer but steady, like a hand knocking gently at the farmhouse door. Caleb Miller was waiting for it. He had not forgotten his chalk-scratched tally from the night before. When his father called up the stairs, "Lights out, Caleb!" the boy blew the oil lamp dark and pulled the quilt over his head. But beneath the quilt his eyes were wide open, listening for the first drop. When it came, tap, he smiled. Then another, tap, tap. He grabbed the nub of chalk hidden under his pillow and leaned over the plank wall beside his bed. One mark, then two, then a space. The roof once again became his slate, the rain his teacher. But tonight, something changed. He did not simply hear the rhythm, he saw it. Each mark he drew felt less like a scratch of chalk and more like a digit in a secret arithmetic. 1, 2, 3. Bursts and pauses. He began to picture the storm as a string of numbers tumbling out of the clouds, as though the sky itself was counting, and the roof was merely speaking aloud what was written higher above. Downstairs, his mother stirred in her sleep. His father shifted heavily on the cot. The farmhouse smelled of damp hay and wood smoke. To any grown man, rain was just weather, inconvenient for haying, merciful for corn. But to Caleb, 12 years old, thin and barefoot on a cold plank floor, the rain was more than weather. It was a code. He began comparing. Between marks on the wall, he counted the ticks of the clock. Between clusters, he counted heartbeats. Then he thought of something new. The cows. He remembered walking behind them in the lane at dusk, hearing their hooves in a slow, patient rhythm. Clop, 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 clop. At times, the herd moved in bursts, many hooves close together. Other times, they spread out, leaving long pauses between. That, too, was like the rain. "Rain sounds like cows," Caleb whispered into the dark, amused by his own thought. And then he thought of the clock, the tick. Tick, tick had a rhythm too, but not like rain. The clock was perfect, steady, mercilessly even. Rain was not. Rain sped up, slowed down, tumbled into bursts. And yet when Caleb compared his chalk tallies from last night to tonight's, the numbers were similar. Not identical, but close. Like two different cows breathing almost in step. He stopped and stared at the board, the chalk trembling in his fingers. What if rain has rules but hides them? The idea made his heart pound. He pressed the chalk to the wall harder, marking clusters, circling them with rough ovals. "This one is like that one," he murmured, tracing similarities. Not the same, but close. He remembered the word his teacher had once used when describing coin tosses: probability. He hadn't understood it then. Tonight, under a leaking roof, he felt the meaning in his bones. Probability wasn't just numbers in a book. It was the roof above his head. The chalk snapped in his hand. The noise startled him. He stared at the tiny crumb left in his palm, then tucked it into a crack in the wall for safekeeping. For a moment, he just listened. The storm outside had shifted, no longer a random scatter, but clusters rolling like distant drums. He counted in whispers. 1. Pause. 2. Pause. 1, 2, 3. Pause. The whispers felt sacred, like prayers. His chest rose and fell, and he realized his breathing was moving with the rain. He exhaled when the drops were far apart, inhaled when they came close. Soon it was no longer clear who was following whom, Caleb or the storm. But then came a voice sharper than thunder. "Caleb!" His father's tone cut up the stairwell, rough with sleep and disapproval. "Stop that scratching. Go to sleep." The boy froze. He hadn't realized the chalk against the plank wall made such a rasp. He dropped the chalk crumb, guilty, his small heart thumping harder than the rain. "I will, Pa," he called back quickly, forcing steadiness into his voice. Silence. Only rain again. But a different rain now. One mixed with the sting of shame. Caleb lay back down, pulling the quilt up. He stared into the dark. To his father, these marks were childish, a waste of time, a boy's nonsense. Tomorrow there would be fences to mend, chores to finish, calves to feed. Numbers scratched into a wall would not put bread on the table. Still, as Caleb closed his eyes, the patterns remained behind his eyelids. Drops falling became digits. Pauses became spaces. Rain was not nonsense. Rain was teaching. By dawn, the storm had passed. Mist hung low over the pasture, rising like smoke from the damp earth. Caleb's father was already in the yard, hammering a loosened board back into the barn wall. Caleb slipped outside, yawning. His eyes caught the chalk marks on the barn wall near the stall, marks he had made earlier that week while watching over the cows. Strange little scratches, groups of 3 and 4. His father had frowned at them, shaking his head. That morning Caleb touched the marks lightly, as if greeting an old friend. In his mind he lined them beside last night's tallies, and he felt it again. A pattern too deep to be accident, too strange to be meaningless. Numbers weren't only in school books. They were in hooves, in heartbeats, in clocks, in rain, everywhere, hidden, waiting for someone to notice. And Caleb, though only 12, had begun to notice. The storm passed, but Caleb Miller's curiosity did not. Vermont mornings after rain carried a damp quiet, broken only by the crow of a rooster or the creak of wagon wheels on wet dirt. Most boys in the valley started their day with chores, hauling buckets, feeding hens, carrying wood. Caleb did the same, but his mind was elsewhere. His pockets bulged not with marbles, but with chalk. It wasn't real classroom chalk, not the kind city schools ordered in tidy boxes. This was the stubby, coarse lime stick his father used to mark sacks of grain, dusty and crumbly, staining Caleb's fingers white. He guarded each stub like treasure. Whenever he was sent to fetch hay or water calves, he carried it along, as though the day might suddenly require mathematics. That morning, with mist still clinging to the fields, Caleb entered the barn. The wooden walls smelled of earth, straw, and milk. Light leaked in thin golden blades between the boards. He paused beside a bare section of wall near the cow stalls, rubbed a hand over the grain of the wood, and pulled out his chalk. Slowly, carefully, he began to copy last night's patterns. 1 line, a pause, 2 lines close together, another pause, 3 lines, then a long gap. His hand moved quick and sure, though the shapes were clumsy. Within minutes the barn wall bore rows of tally marks, uneven and crooked, but carrying a rhythm only he could see. He circled clusters, drew arrows, even tried to write numbers beside them. 3, 2, 4. Numbers not just as sums but as sequences. The barn, silent but for the shifting cows, had become his blackboard. "Boy!" Caleb nearly dropped the chalk. He turned and saw a tall figure in the doorway, Mr. Dawson, the village schoolteacher. A thin man with spectacles and a perpetually furrowed brow, Dawson sometimes came by the farm to barter eggs for firewood. "What's this nonsense?" the teacher asked, stepping closer, peering at the marks on the wall. Caleb froze. His throat went dry. "Are you drawing fences?" Dawson's voice was sharp, half mocking. "Or tallying how many flies you've swatted." Caleb shook his head. His words came halting. It's the rain." "The rain?" Dawson adjusted his glasses, incredulous. "You filled half the barn wall with scratches and tell me it's the rain?" "Yes, sir, the pattern it makes. It isn't random, not really. If you count the time between drops, it—" "Enough," Dawson cut him off. His face hardened. "Mathematics belongs on paper, boy. In a proper classroom, not scrawled across barnwood like a child's game." He reached out as though to wipe the chalk away with his sleeve. "No!" Caleb blurted, stepping between the teacher and the wall. His voice trembled, but his stance was stubborn. "Please, don't." For a moment, Dawson just stared at him. Then he snorted, lips curling. "Superstitious scribbles. Waste of chalk. Your father's right. You dream too much." And with that he turned and strode away, boots crunching against the wet yard. The barn felt colder after he left. Caleb's shoulders sagged. He glanced at the chalk marks, his heart twisting. They looked foolish now, crooked scars across the wood, meaningless to anyone else. He thought of erasing them himself, saving his father the embarrassment if Dawson spread gossip in town. Yet when he raised his sleeve, he couldn't. The marks were his secret language with the rain. If he wiped them away, it would be like erasing a voice only he could hear. So instead, he whispered to the wall, as if confessing, "You're not nonsense. I'll keep you safe." That night, after chores, he sneaked back and added more. Quietly, by lantern light, he copied the rhythms he'd counted from the roof again. His chalk hand moved faster, more confident, as though racing against the memory before it faded. Each tally was a promise. No matter who mocked him, he would not let the rain's numbers vanish. Days passed. Caleb carried on with his chores, silent and dutiful, but every spare minute his chalk scratched against the barn wall. The wall became crowded. Tallies, clusters, circles, even rough diagrams where he tried to show bursts and pauses with little waves. It was messy, almost frantic, but alive with meaning. And always, he kept it hidden. Whenever his father entered, Caleb would lean against the wall, arms folded, body shielding the marks. If a neighbor passed through, he swept a pile of hay against the baseboards to disguise them. He had learned the world did not yet understand, but the barn understood. One evening, after the cows had been milked and the sun was bleeding red through the slats, Caleb stepped back from the wall and took it in whole. It was no longer just scratches. It was a field of mathematics, sprawling and raw. Patterns spoke to him. Repetition, variation, clusters like constellations in the sky. The roof had sung, the chalk had translated, and now the barn carried the song like scripture. Caleb's chest swelled with a quiet certainty. He was poor, small, often scolded for daydreaming, but he had found something vast, something even a teacher could not see. He touched the chalk to the wall one last time, pressing it hard so the white mark gleamed in the twilight. Then he whispered, "Steady and sure. One day, someone will read this." It was late September when the rain finally gave way to crisp skies. The maples along the Vermont road flared red and gold, and the air carried the smell of wood smoke and cider. In the Miller farmhouse, chores filled every hour. Apples to gather, potatoes to dig, wood to stack before frost. Caleb moved with his father through the work, silent as always, but his mind was elsewhere, on the barn wall, where chalk scars told stories no one else could hear. That Saturday evening, his parents went into town for supplies. Caleb followed, tugging along reluctantly. His father wanted nails and rope. His mother needed flour and kerosene. Caleb, as usual, kept his eyes down, pockets heavy with chalk stubs. The town's only diner sat across from the feed store, its neon sign buzzing faintly. The Millers stopped there for pie and coffee before heading home. Caleb slid into a booth by the window. his shoulders hunched, listening absently as his parents chatted with neighbors. His gaze drifted to the rain-stained glass where drops left faint tracks from an earlier drizzle. Without thinking, he reached for a paper napkin and stub of pencil he'd tucked in his coat. He began to mark the napkin. 1 dash, 2 dashes, space. Then another cluster. He wasn't copying rain now, only remembering it, summoning the rhythm from memory. He did not notice the man at the counter. Professor Nathaniel Halloway was on his way back from a lecture in Montreal. He was a tall man, hair already silver though not yet old, with sharp eyes that carried the fatigue of long study. Harvard had been his home for decades. Halls of blackboards filled with equations, long nights chasing patterns in numbers that refused to yield. That night, he stopped at the diner simply for coffee. He ordered black, folded his overcoat neatly on the stool beside him, and pulled from his satchel a sheaf of notes. He was reviewing a stubborn problem: the mathematics of randomness, distribution of intervals in events that appeared without pattern. It was the same wall he had struck for years, how to predict what looked unpredictable. He sipped, frowned, scribbled. Then his eye wandered. At a booth near the window sat a thin boy, maybe 12, hunched over a napkin. His small hand moved quickly, scratching short dashes, clusters, then spaces. Not doodles. Too regular for that. Lines, groups, intervals. Halloway's trained eye recognized the rhythm of counting. The professor's pulse quickened. He rose, coffee forgotten, and walked to the booth. Caleb startled as the shadow fell across his napkin. "What are you writing there, son?" the man asked, voice calm but intent. Caleb clutched the napkin instinctively, shielding it. "Nothing, sir." "Doesn't look like nothing." The man adjusted his spectacles, peering closer. "Those marks! You're counting something." Caleb hesitated. His parents were still talking at the counter, paying no attention. He lowered his voice. "It's the rain." "The rain?" "Yes, sir. The way it falls. Sometimes one drop, then two quick, then a pause. I write it down." Halloway blinked. For a moment he thought he had misheard. But the boy's tone was not fanciful. It was matter-of-fact, shy but steady. "You mean you're measuring the intervals between drops?" Caleb's brow furrowed. "Intervals?" "The spaces, the time between." The boy nodded slowly. "Yes, the spaces. They aren't the same. But they're not nonsense either. They sort of repeat." Halloway's breath caught. His mind leapt to terms: Poisson distribution, stochastic modeling, renewal processes, years of lectures and research. The very problem on his desk in Cambridge, and here was a farm boy scrawling patterns on a napkin with a stub of pencil. "May I see?" the professor asked gently. Caleb's hand tightened. For a long moment he said nothing. He had learned already what grown men thought of his scratches. Nonsense. Daydreams. A waste of time. But something in the stranger's voice, low, earnest, curious, softened him. Slowly he slid the napkin across the table. Halloway lifted it carefully, as though it were a fragile artifact. His eyes scanned the rows. Single dashes, double dashes, clusters circled, intervals counted. Primitive, uneven, but unmistakable. The boy had captured the signature of randomness as cleanly as any graduate student might. The professor's hand trembled. "What's your name?" he asked. "Caleb. Caleb Miller." "Well, Caleb, do you know what you've done here?" The boy shook his head. "It's just the rain talking." Halloway stared at him, almost unnerved. To the boy, it was nothing more than listening. To Holloway, it was the outline of an answer Harvard had chased for decades. He folded the napkin, slipped it into his pocket, and said only, "Keep listening, son. Don't stop." That night, long after the miller's wagon rattled home, Professor Holloway sat in his Cambridge office under the glow of a desk lamp. The napkin lay unfolded before him, fragile and smudged. Around it, chalkboards loomed, crowded with equations on probability distributions, renewal theory, random processes, all the language of uncertainty. He compared the napkin's crude marks with the equations. To his astonishment, they aligned, not perfectly, but in spirit. The boy had, by ear, stumbled upon a model of stochastic behavior. Rain on a tin roof had taught him what textbooks struggled to explain. Holloway pressed his hand to his forehead. He had seen many students, many prodigies even, but never this. A farm boy, with no books, no lectures, only storms and chalk. He leaned back in his chair, the napkin trembling slightly in his hand, and whispered, "Harvard must never know where this came from." The first time Caleb Miller saw Harvard, he could hardly breathe. It was late October, the Vermont hills already browned with frost, when Professor Nathaniel Holloway invited the Millers to Cambridge under the pretense of showing the boy a fine university. Caleb's parents, plain farm folk, thought it would be an afternoon diversion, something to make their quiet son widen his eyes, then return to chores with better spirit. But for Caleb, stepping onto the cobblestones of Harvard Yard was like stepping into another world. The trees were bare in the autumn chill, the air sharp with the smell of old brick and ink. Students in coats hurried across the quads, books under their arms, and everywhere rose the buildings, towers, spires, endless windows that seemed to watch him. He craned his neck. Never had he seen so many rooms. Never had he imagined so many blackboards existed in one place. Professor Holloway walked with him, steady and unhurried, though his eyes flicked often to the boy's expression. "What do you think, Caleb?" he asked. Caleb swallowed. "It's bigger than the town." Holloway smiled faintly. "In a way, it is a town of questions." They entered a lecture hall. The ceilings soared high, rafters echoing with the ghost of countless voices. Benches stretched in long rows, and at the front, Caleb's breath caught, the blackboards. Not one, but three, stacked on sliding frames, chalk smeared from the day's lectures. Symbols curved across them like vines. Summation signs, integrals, and lambdas. The language of storms, though he could not yet read it. The boy drifted forward, hardly aware of his parents behind him. His fingers hovered over the board, almost touching the chalk dust. He could still smell rain in the faint lines of half-erased equations. That evening, Holloway excused himself from the Millers and arranged for Caleb to stay in a small dormitory room so the boy can rest before the trip home. His parents agreed, trusting the professor's reputation, but Caleb did not rest. Sleep would not come. Through the window he heard a drizzle begin, soft against the glass. The sound lit his veins like fire. The rain was calling again. He slipped out of bed, tugged on his worn coat, and padded through the silent corridors. The lamps were low. The campus hushed. Past midnight, the yard belonged only to the storm and the few who still studied by candle. Caleb's feet carried him back to the lecture hall. The great wooden door groaned as he pushed it. Inside, the room lay empty, the air heavy with chalk dust and echoes. And the boards, wiped mostly clean, still bore ghosts of the day's work. He climbed the stairs to the front, his heart thumping. He looked at the faint remnants of equations. He could not name them, but he felt them, as if he had been here before. The symbols were like raindrops, not random scribbles, but notes in a hidden music. He picked up a stub of chalk. His hand shook. Outside, the rain tapped the windows, a rhythm as steady as any metronome. Caleb closed his eyes, listening. Then he opened them and wrote. 1 line, 2, a cluster, a pause. He began to draw tallies, then numbers, then arrows linking them. Before he knew it, he was building on the faint ghost of the professor's lecture, filling in the spaces with his own memory of storms. His childish symbols curved into something new, a model not of certainty, but of likelihood. How often, how rarely, when a burst might come, when a pause might stretch long. Minutes stretched into hours. The chalk scratched and danced. The boy's world narrowed to roof, rain, board, and hand. At 2 in the morning, the door creaked. Caleb froze. A young man entered, tall, tired-eyed, a stack of books under his arm. He was a graduate student, coming for solitude. But instead of an empty hall, he found a farm boy in an oversized coat, chalk in hand, the blackboard behind him alive with strange, half-formed equations. The student stopped dead. "What? What are you doing here?" he whispered. Caleb's face burned. He stepped back from the board. "I'm sorry," he stammered. "I was just listening." "Listening?" "The rain, it tells me how to write." The student dropped his books onto a bench, eyes wide. He scanned the board, rows of marks, clusters circled, intervals compared, numbers written like music. His mouth went dry. This was no random doodle. It was probability, raw, instinctive, but profound. "Good Lord," he breathed. You're solving it." Caleb shook his head quickly. "No, sir. I don't know what it is. I just write what I hear." The student stepped closer, trembling. "Do you realize? Harvard has been wrestling with this problem for decades." But the boy only looked down at his chalk-smeared hands, embarrassed. "It's just the rain, sir." The clock tolled softly outside, 2 chimes, clear in the storm. Caleb glanced at the blackboard one last time, then set the chalk down. His shoulders slumped with weariness. "Don't tell anyone," he whispered. "They'll think it's foolish." The student opened his mouth to protest, then stopped. He studied the boy, thin, pale, eyes tired, but burning. He nodded slowly. "All right, I won't." Caleb slipped past him and into the hall, footsteps echoing. The graduate student remained, staring at the living blackboard, at the strange proof a child had drawn from rain. And for the first time in his life, the young scholar felt he was standing at the edge of a revelation, one written not in ink, but in storm water and chalk. By morning, the lecture hall was alive again. Students shuffled in, voices echoing, chalk snapping, coats hung on pegs. The blackboards had been partly cleaned by the janitor, but not entirely. On the far left panel, faint chalk ghosts lingered. Caleb Miller sat quietly in the back row, hands folded in his lap, watching. His parents thought he was still asleep in the dormitory, but Professor Holloway had allowed him to attend a morning lecture. Caleb's eyes, however, were not on the professor's words. They were fixed on the half-erased markings that remained from the night before. His markings. The graduate student from last night had not touched them. They remained there, dim and pale but undeniable. To Caleb, they looked like footprints in snow, fragile, soon to be trampled, but proof that he had walked there. The lecture that morning was on probability. Professor Holloway himself took the podium. He spoke of rare events scattered in time, such as radioactive decay, bus arrivals, or raindrops. Then he turned, lifted a piece of chalk, and wrote slowly so all could see. P-cho T eeks E mu lambda nyan T. He explained gently, as though speaking to farmers in a town meeting rather than to restless students. This means the chance that you must wait longer than a certain time, t, before the next event, say the next raindrop, is equal to a curve that falls smoothly as time grows longer. The letter lambda stands for the average speed at which the events happen. If rain usually gives 5 drops a minute, then lambda is 5. The longer you wait, the smaller the chance that nothing has happened yet. Students scribbled notes. Some yawned. Caleb, small in his wooden bench, leaned forward, heart pounding. He had never seen the equation written before, but the meaning was clear as the barn wall. It was the waiting time he had measured by breath and heartbeat. He understood it not from books, but from nights spent awake under tin and storm. And then Holloway paused. He gestured to the chalk ghosts still on the far left board. "Curious," he said. "Someone seems to have been experimenting." Heads turned. A few students chuckled. To them, the half-formed tallies and arrows looked childish. But Holloway's eyes narrowed. Not so curious, perhaps. These marks, though clumsy, trace the skeleton of what we struggle with even here. Randomness with rhythm. A murmur rippled through the room. That evening, when the hall emptied, Holloway found Caleb again. The boy stood awkwardly near the door, clutching his coat. "Caleb," the professor said quietly, "would you show me?" The boy blinked. "Show you?" "What you hear. When it rains. Show me how you write it." Caleb hesitated, then stepped to the board. He picked up a stick of chalk, inhaled sharply, and let his hand move. Marks appeared, short, long, clustered, spaced. Then he drew arrows, circled groups, and beneath them scrawled numbers. 5 lines in all, simple, unpolished, but alive with meaning. He turned, ashamed, expecting laughter. But silence filled the hall. Graduate students, lingering in the back, stared open-mouthed. They saw it, a crude but startlingly accurate model of arrival times. Caleb had, in essence, sketched a distribution function that mirrored rain's rhythm, what professors had chased for years. One student whispered, "He has reduced it to 5 lines." Another hissed back, "But that is impossible. He has not read Kolmogorov. He does not know stochastic theory." "It does not matter," the first replied. "It works." Caleb shifted uncomfortably. "It is nothing, just listening." Holloway's throat tightened. His life had been spent lecturing about uncertainty, and here stood a barefoot farm boy who could hear it in raindrops. But not everyone was awed. From the doorway, a tall, severe man entered. The head of the department, Professor William Ashcroft. His presence silenced the room. "What is this spectacle?" he demanded, eyes narrowing at the chalk. "A child? In my lecture hall?" Holloway stiffened. "This boy has noticed something remarkable." "Nonsense," Ashcroft snapped. He strode to the board, glaring at the simple tallies. "Scratches, folklore. You insult the discipline by entertaining this." "It is not nonsense," one graduate student blurted, voice trembling. "It mirrors the models we study." Ashcroft's eyes blazed. "Enough. I will not have Harvard sullied by peasant scribbles." He seized an eraser, swiped it hard across the board, and the 5 lines vanished into dust. Caleb flinched as if struck. His hands curled into fists at his sides. When Ashcroft swept out, the room remained hushed. Students glanced at one another, fear mingling with outrage. No one dared challenge the man's authority, but Holloway leaned close to Caleb, voice low but steady. "Listen to me, son. They can erase chalk, but they cannot erase truth. Do you understand?" Caleb swallowed hard. He nodded, though his throat ached. Outside, rain began again, tapping faintly at the window panes. To Caleb, it sounded like defiance. The storm was not finished singing, no matter how many blackboards were wiped clean. The next day dawned gray and heavy with mist. Cambridge streets glistened from a night rain, and the yard smelled of damp stone and fallen leaves. Caleb Miller woke early, heart still beating with the memory of chalk in his hand, his 5 trembling lines across the board. He slipped from the dormitory and hurried back to the lecture hall. The doors stood ajar, light spilling onto the worn wooden steps. He pushed inside, breath shallow with anticipation. The boards were clean. Every trace, every circle, every number, gone. The chalk he had pressed so carefully was nothing but dust swept into a bin. Caleb stood frozen, his small hands curling into fists. To him, it felt not like erasing chalk, but like erasing a voice. A teacher's voice, a song only he could hear. His throat tightened. He wanted to shout, to ask why, but the cavernous hall only gave back silence. Behind him, footsteps. A cluster of graduate students entered, carrying books. They saw him standing alone before the spotless blackboards, his shoulders stiff. One of them, the same young man who had found him writing at 2 in the morning, lowered his voice. They wiped it all. Caleb nodded, unable to speak. The student hesitated, then reached into his satchel. But not before I took this. He pulled out a small camera, an old, boxy contraption used for research. From inside his folder, he slid a photograph across to Caleb. It was grainy, black and white, but clear enough. Caleb's 5 lines, tallies, circles, arrows, preserved. Caleb's eyes widened. He touched the photo with trembling fingers. "They can erase the board," the student said softly, "but not the truth." Word began to spread, first in whispers, then in murmurs that drifted across the yard. Students passed the photograph hand to hand, whispering of the farm boy who had written probability as though it were music. Some were skeptical, others curious, but the image spoke for itself. In dining halls and dormitories, talk grew louder. "Have you seen it? The boy's chalk?" Ashcroft had it wiped away. But look, here's the photo. By week's end, Caleb's erased proof had become both legend and controversy. Professor Holloway sought Caleb out one evening, finding him sitting alone on the dormitory steps. The boy held the photograph on his lap, staring at it as if afraid it might fade too. "Caleb," Holloway said gently, "do not despair. Sometimes what vanishes in chalk grows stronger in memory." Caleb looked up, his voice barely a whisper. "Why would they erase it?" The professor sighed. "Pride, son. For some men, truth is less frightening than the thought of being outshone by a farm boy with no books." Caleb swallowed hard. He was only 12. He did not crave fame or recognition. He only wanted to keep listening to the rain. Yet already he felt the weight of Harvard pressing against him, not welcoming, but resisting. That night, he returned secretly to the barn wall in his memory. He could almost smell the straw, see the crooked tally marks he had once guarded. The barn had not judged him. The rain had not judged him. Only here, among these polished walls, did men call his listening nonsense. But he still had the photograph, proof that his listening was real. As he drifted into uneasy sleep, Caleb whispered to himself, "They can take the board. They cannot take the rain." And outside, as though in answer, the storm tapped once more against the Harvard windows, an endless teacher, refusing to be silenced. By November, Cambridge was restless. The air carried the bite of oncoming winter, and with it, rumors that seemed to travel faster than the wind between ivy walls. Students in dark coats gathered in corners of dining halls, in the hush of libraries, on the benches of Harvard Yard. They leaned close, voices low, as though speaking of something forbidden. "Have you heard? The boy from Vermont. They say he solved the randomness problem, on a blackboard at night." "No, I saw it. There's a photograph. Always, the conversation ended with glances over shoulders as if Professor Ashcroft himself might be listening. Caleb Miller knew little of this storm at first. He spent his days quietly, following Holloway, sitting at the edges of lecture halls, listening more than speaking. The photograph of his 5 lines had been tucked into his pocket like a secret talisman. He touched it sometimes, reassured it was still there. But he began to notice the stares, students whispering when he walked by. A hand extended once, then withdrawn. Some smiled with sympathy, others smirked with disbelief. To them, he was either prodigy or pretender, nothing in between. At 12 years old, he longed only to slip back into silence. Yet silence was no longer possible. The photograph spread further than campus. A graduate student, eager for recognition, had shown it to a friend at a Boston paper. Within days, a short column appeared. A farm boy sketches solution to Harvard's hardest problem? The piece was cautious, even mocking, but it was enough. Other papers picked it up. Soon, scholars in New York and Chicago were writing letters, demanding to know whether Harvard truly harbored a barefoot genius who could hear mathematics in rainfall. The whispers had become thunder. Holloway, torn between pride and fear, met Caleb in his office late one night. The boy sat stiffly in a chair too large for him, staring at the polished desk. "They are talking about you, Caleb," the professor said gently. "I never asked them to." "I know," Holloway sighed. "But you touched something too large to stay hidden. People will want to use it. They will want to claim it." Caleb's brow furrowed. "Use it?" "Yes. The patterns you found, what rain taught you, can be applied to more than weather. Banks want it for predicting markets, insurance companies for calculating risks, even factories for scheduling machines. To them, it is money." Caleb shook his head quickly. "It was never money. It was just the rain." But Holloway knew better. Once an idea left the chalkboard, the world rarely let it remain pure. Soon, men in dark suits began appearing on campus. Representatives of firms carrying contracts and promises. They sought Holloway first, then pushed to meet the boy. One evening, a man in a bowler hat stopped Caleb outside the library. "Son, you've got something powerful," the man said smoothly. "We'd like to help you put it to use. You'll be well compensated, of course." Caleb stepped back, clutching his coat. "I don't want money. I just listen." The man smiled thinly. "Listening won't pay your family's debts." Caleb fled, heart hammering, and did not tell his parents. The storm only grew. Professors debated in faculty lounges. Was the boy authentic or a fraud paraded by Holloway? Students argued in late-night dorm rooms, some defending him fiercely, others mocking him as a farm curiosity. The name Caleb Miller had become a dividing line. And at the center of it all, the boy himself sat silently in lecture halls, rain tapping faintly against the windows, wishing he could vanish back to his barn wall in Vermont. One night, snow threatened in the air, a sharp wind rattling the yard. Caleb stood alone beneath a street lamp, the photograph cold in his hands. He stared at it long and hard, then whispered into the wind, "They don't hear it. Not the way I do." For the first time, he wondered if the rain's language, so clear, so healing in the quiet of home, might become twisted here, turned into something harsher, louder, unrecognizable. The storm was no longer only on the roof. It was over Cambridge itself. The Great Hall of Harvard was not often filled to its rafters, but that December morning, every bench, every aisle, even the balcony rail was crowded. Professors in dark robes, students in heavy coats, journalists scribbling in notebooks. The hall hummed with anticipation. At the front stood a long table, draped in red cloth. Behind it sat the Council of Professors, solemn as judges. At the center was Professor William Ashcroft, his face sharp as a blade. To his right sat Nathaniel Halloway, older, gentler, his silver hair catching the light. And before them, on a chair far too large for him, sat Caleb Miller. Barely 12 years old, hands folded tight in his lap. He looked like a sparrow caught inside a cathedral. The purpose was simple, though no one dared speak it plainly. Harvard wished to decide whether the boy from Vermont was a miracle or fraud. Ashcroft spoke first, his voice carrying across the hall. This institution cannot be mocked by whispers and fables. We will hear, here and now, whether this child's so-called discovery bears any merit. Halloway leaned forward. With respect, Professor, this is not fable. The boy has seen patterns where others have not. Ashcroft's eyes narrowed. We shall see. He gestured to Caleb. Boy, show us. A blackboard loomed behind the council, freshly cleaned. Chalk lay waiting. Caleb stared at it, his chest rising and falling. He could feel hundreds of eyes pressing against his back. His throat ached. Then, softly, faintly, he heard it. Rain on the roof. The storm outside had begun, drops tapping against the high windows of the hall. The sound was muffled but steady, the same music he had known all his life. Caleb stood. He took the chalk. His hand shook at first, then steadied as he listened. Tap, tap, pause. He drew tallies, clusters, spaces, circles, numbers beneath. 5 lines. When he finished, he stepped aside. The board bore his strange but simple script, the rhythm of rain captured in chalk. The hall was silent. Ashcroft rose. His voice dripped with disdain. Scratches. Childish scratches. This is no proof, no theorem. It is the doodling of a farm hand. A murmur of agreement from some professors, but others frowned, leaning forward, seeing something deeper. Halloway stood, his voice firm. Look again. What you call scratches is the same waiting time law we write with symbols and equations. The boy has translated it by ear. He has done with chalk and rain what we attempt with pages of formulas. Ashcroft's jaw tightened. Nonsense. Then, from the gallery, a graduate student rose. The same one who had found Caleb writing at 2 in the morning. He held up a photograph, his hand trembling but his voice clear. I was there. I saw him write it. This is the record. He passed the photo down. Professors leaned in, black and white, grainy but undeniable. Caleb's lines, his circles, his arrows. More students stood. Some spoke of whispers, of nights spent debating the meaning of the boy's reign. The tide in the hall shifted, murmurs now of awe, not mockery. Ashcroft struck the table with his hand. Enough! Harvard is not a place for barnyard myths. We build upon centuries of rigor. We do not bow to childish intuition. Caleb turned to him then, voice small but steady. Sir, I do not know your words. I only know what I hear. The rain is not chaos. It has a rhythm. It waits, then falls, then waits again. I only wrote what it told me. He touched his chest. The rain speaks the same way my heart beats. Not perfect, not even, but with a pattern. That is all. The hall grew still. Even Ashcroft faltered, just for a breath. At the back, the storm struck louder against the windows, drops drumming in chorus. It seemed, for one fleeting moment, as though the sky itself were testifying. Then an old professor, white-bearded and long silent, rose from the council table. His voice was rough but kind. I have spent my life studying probability. I have never heard it spoken this way. Perhaps we should listen. One by one, heads turned. Not all in agreement, but enough. The tide had shifted. The boy was no longer dismissed. He was heard. That night, when the hall finally emptied, Caleb sat alone on the steps outside. The storm still fell, tapping gently on stone. He pulled the photograph from his pocket, holding it to the lamplight. They had tried to put him on trial. They had questioned his worth, his right to stand before them. But the rain had spoken for him, and in the silence that followed, even the proudest of men had listened. Snow lay heavy on the roofs of Cambridge when the council finally issued its verdict. It was not a formal certificate, not a medal or a degree. Harvard would never grant those to a 12-year-old farm boy. But the truth could not be erased. Professors who once scoffed now admitted, cautiously, that Caleb Miller had seen what others had not. His lines on the board were rough, but they carried the bones of a solution long sought by scholars. In the dining halls, students spoke his name with reverence. In journals and letters, mathematicians debated his discovery. And in the quiet office of Nathaniel Halloway, a boy from Vermont sat with his hands folded, waiting. "You understand, Caleb," the professor said gently. "They will use this. They will try to shape it for finance, for insurance, for things you have never seen. You have given them a tool, though you never asked to." Caleb looked down at his small hands. "I never wanted a tool. I just wanted to listen." Halloway smiled sadly. "And that is why it matters." By spring, the Miller family returned home. The farm was waiting. Fences to mend, seeds to plant, cows to feed. The world might whisper of equations, but the soil demanded simpler truths. Caleb slipped easily back into the rhythm of chores, though something in him had changed. The barn wall still bore his chalk, faint and weathered by time. He touched it gently, as one greets an old friend. For a moment he feared it might look small compared to Harvard's blackboards, but it did not. To him it was grander still. This wall had been his first university, the rain his first professor. Years passed. Caleb grew, not into a scholar cloaked in prestige, but into a teacher of a quieter kind. With what little money the family could spare, and with Halloway's help, he repaired the abandoned schoolhouse at the edge of town. Its roof still leaked in places. He let it leak. Children from nearby farms came hesitantly at first, then eagerly. They brought muddy boots, patched clothes, curious eyes. Caleb welcomed them, placed chalk in their small hands, and told them to listen. "Do not fear the rain," he said softly. "It is only numbers falling from the sky. Every drop is a question, every pause an answer." He showed them how to tally on boards, how to see rhythm in hoofbeats, in clock ticks, in their own heartbeats. The children laughed, counted, listened. To them, mathematics was no longer distant, but as close as the sound on the tin roof. Word spread again, not through Harvard this time, but through villages. Parents marveled that their children, once afraid of sums, now found joy in chalk and sound. They began to call the little school the School of Rain. Old farmers wandered in on stormy evenings, sitting at the back while the roof drummed above. Caleb would stand before the class, no longer a shy boy, but a steady young man, and explain in plain words what professors had once wrapped in symbols. The longer you wait for the next drop, the less likely it is to take much longer. That is all the formula means. The world looks uncertain, but it has patterns. The elders nodded, comforted, as if hearing not numbers but a sermon of patience. Years later, when Caleb himself was gray, travelers from far away still came to Vermont. Some were scholars, curious about the legend of the farm boy who heard mathematics in rainfall. Some were children grown, bringing their own children to sit beneath the leaky roof. And always, when the storm came, Caleb would pause his lesson, tilt his head and smile. The class would fall silent, listening. Rain would tap the roof, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, never meaningless. "Do you hear it?" he would ask softly. "That is the oldest teacher we have." One evening, as twilight fell and the roof sang gently, Caleb sat by the window alone. His hair was white, his hands lined. On the table lay a folded photograph, yellowed with age, the grainy image of his erased proof at Harvard. He touched it once, then set it aside. He no longer needed the photograph. The proof was alive in every child who had ever listened to the roof, in every farmer who had found patience in a storm, in every scholar who remembered that truth can be born in silence. Outside, rain fell steady, tapping the roof in rhythms both ancient and new. Caleb closed his eyes. To him, it was not just mathematics. It was forgiveness. It was belonging. It was the world whispering back. Thank you, dear friends, for staying with this story until the very end, walking beside young Caleb Miller from a leaking roof in Vermont to the great halls of Harvard. If these hours have brought back the memory of rain on your own rooftops, or reminded you that wisdom often grows in the humblest places, then that is the truest reward. Thank you for your time, for your listening heart. May the days ahead be gentle to you, and may every drop of rain on your roof sound like a small hymn of comfort and peace.